Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us with comments or questions, then you can give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234. You can also send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. You can reach out to us over our Facebook page or even on YouTube if that's what's easiest for you. You're also welcome to join us in person at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for our 10 a.m. Sunday worship, also our 4 p.m. Sunday worship, and our 7 p.m. Wednesday Bible study. Today we are talking about the Torah. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, Torah is just a Hebrew word that means law, or maybe a little bit more precisely, instruction. There are 613 commandments within what is called the Torah, and those commandments are referred to as mitzvoth, so the singular of mitzvoth would be mitzvah, and bar mitzvah, if you're familiar with that term, that's the idea, a son of the law or son of instruction. But it's not just a long list of 613 commandments, one after another. The Torah is much more complex than that. Let's talk about authorship here for a moment. The Torah comprises the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, traditionally, Moses is considered to be the author of these books, but it's not only tradition that establishes this. The Old Testament seems to generally attribute these books to Moses. For example, in Ezra chapter 6, verse 18, "And they set priests in their division and the Levites in their division for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses." In right about the same time period, Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1 makes a very similar attribution. "On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God." That's one of the particular commandments that is found in the Torah. Now there are others, but these are the two cleanest and clearest of the attributions of the first 5 books of the Old Testament to Moses. It's not just the Old Testament. The New Testament attributes these books to Moses as well, and it's not just some guy saying that Moses wrote them, it's Jesus himself. In Luke chapter 20, beginning in verse 27, "There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, 'Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother.'" So these Sadducees have attributed the law to Moses, but it's not just them. In verse 37, Jesus says, "But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." So Jesus is making a point about the resurrection there. He's not really trying to indicate the authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but he's saying that it's in Moses, that Moses showed this, and it's in the book of Exodus when Moses meets God at the burning bush on Mount Sinai for the first time. Okay, now I could see somebody saying, well, but that story involved Moses. So it's not necessarily saying that Moses is the author of these books. Well, let's keep looking at some more examples. Luke chapter 24, verse 27, "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." He's clearly talking about divisions of the Old Testament, and he mentions prophets, that's one division, and then another division seems to be Moses. In John chapter 1, verse 45 also indicates this. "Philip found Nathanael and said to him, 'We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.'" Now this time it's not Jesus, but it's 2 people who are about to become Jesus' disciples, and they claim that the law was written by Moses. Romans 10:5, "For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them." Okay, that's a lot. And it's worth pointing out that none of these actually says straight out, Moses wrote these particular 5 books. But that's pretty clearly the assumption that all of these people, including Jesus, are making. There are, however, some hints throughout these 5 books of some later editing, not in a heavy-handed way, and it's not as if they were changing the details of the narrative or changing the words of God. It's that they were changing things like geographic names. Let me give you an example. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 14 says, "When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan." Dan. Okay. We've also got in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 1 says, "Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan." Dan. Dan is the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and yet here in Genesis and also in Deuteronomy, before the Israelites actually occupy the promised land, there's a place in that land that's being referred to as Dan. Now, is it maybe just a coincidence? No, it's not. That place got its name because the tribe of the Danites took it over. And its former name was Laish, and it was changed later on to Dan. So what's happened here is that somebody later on has replaced the old name of the city with the new name of the city that was in common use that everybody knew. There are also phrases like "to this day" that show up several times throughout the Torah, meaning, well, obviously much later than the time period in which the books are set. Otherwise, it would not be any great achievement to say, it's the same to this day. Wow, how long has it been? Well, I wrote it about 3 weeks ago. Now, if it's been maybe 100 or 200 or 300 years, now we're talking. Genesis 19:37 says, "The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day." Verse 38 says the same thing about the Ammonites. Genesis 22:14 says, "So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said, to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." Genesis 26, verse 33 says, "He called it Sheba, therefore the name of that city is called Beersheba to this day." And then Genesis 32:32, "Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh." Chapter 35, verse 20 says, "And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day." Chapter 47, verse 26, "So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's." Now, in all of these cases, numerous as they have been, an argument could be made that because the events that were being recorded were actually being recorded about 500 or so years later, that perhaps this is just Moses saying that it's been the same for the last 500 years. Worthwhile argument to have. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, the same cannot be said. Deuteronomy 3, verse 14, "Jair the Manassite took all the region of Argob, that is, Bashan, as far as the border of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and called the villages after his own name Havoth Jair, as it is to this day." This is like on the order of months after this actually occurred. And he's saying, but to this very day it hasn't changed. And the best example of this is in Deuteronomy 34, where verse 6 says, "And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day." This actually takes place slightly after the death of Moses, and so it would be difficult to argue that Moses himself wrote that. It's possible that he was doing it prophetically, but it's a lot simpler to assume that somebody else, perhaps Joshua after him, wrote that part. But none of that detracts from the tradition of Mosaic authorship. It's just been handed down through the ages with scribes essentially translating it for current audiences, just like we do today when we put the Bible into modern English. Now, the other extreme on the authorship of the Torah is born out of 19th century skepticism, and you might have heard it called the documentary hypothesis. If you're not familiar with this idea, it's the notion that the Torah was stitched together from multiple competing traditions. It's easiest to see where this notion comes from by looking at Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Genesis 1, beginning in verse 26, Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Tracking with me so far? Now let's jump down a few verses into chapter 2, beginning in verse 4. "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed." What? Didn't the story just cover the creation of man? Why cover it again right after the first time? Why aren't they identical, furthermore? There are also some shifts between calling God, at least that's our term for it, Elohim is the Hebrew word, and calling him the Lord, or Yahweh, or Jehovah. And so the idea is that these are from competing sources that tell roughly the same story from different perspectives with different details, and that later on they were compiled and stitched together into a kludgy whole. Now, it's really not a problem to acknowledge these sorts of differences while still maintaining that this came from God, and even maintaining that it came from Moses. First of all, the supposedly different sources are not all that clearly defined. Scholars disagree a lot. And there are practically infinite different arrangements, and anywhere between just 2 documents and 50 bajillion, depending on whom you ask. It's also incredibly condescending to say that these differences indicate it's all a farce. Don't you think at some point the people making it up would have realized that this was a problem and fixed it? Now, that doesn't exactly serve as evidence of its truth. That would be crazy. But it's not fair to go the other way either. When we look at all of the evidence, it's not something that should make you lie awake at night. For example, let's consider when Moses would have written these books. Obviously, he didn't write them when he was a small child. It seems pretty clear that he didn't write them until after he had led the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. So he wrote them during the period of wilderness wandering, which took 40 years. Why don't you go and compare some of your writing from 40 years ago to the way that you write today? Many of you can't even do that yet, can you? Of course, Moses' writing style is going to change somewhat over time. Also, before they were rescued from slavery in Egypt, the nation of Israel had forgotten God, but not everyone had forgotten. Surely they knew something, at least about their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they cried out to God for help, at least sort of. In Exodus 2, let's read verses 23 through 25. "During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." On top of that, in the previous chapter, in verse 17, we learn that the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the Israelites don't really know God anymore at this time, but they do still know something. Every ancient civilization had stories that they passed down, and there are substantial similarities, believe it or not, between the creation and flood story in Genesis and those in the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and others. There's a common source at the root of all of these, and that source is God. Now in Genesis, it's quite likely that the first several chapters are the oral tradition of the elders of Israel committed to text, we trust with the aid of the Holy Spirit. But that's not really what it's all about in the Torah. The Torah is fundamentally not just history, it's instruction. There is a lot of narrative and a lot of explanation, etc., but the core of the law of Moses is the law part. I'm sure you're familiar with the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments were given to Israel at the very beginning of the law. In Exodus chapter 19, as God is preparing to do this, let's read the first 7 verses of the chapter. On the 3rd new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. This is God's proposal to the nation of Israel. He has shown them that he loves them. He's shown them that he's able to provide for them and to protect them, and he's given them many gifts. And now he seeks to sort of make it official. And they agree. They are now locked into a covenant with each other, much like a marriage. Verse 8, All the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do. This contract, like any other, comes with rules for each party. God makes clear his responsibilities and promises, and he spends much of the rest of Exodus and most of Leviticus and much of Numbers and practically all of Deuteronomy outlining their contractual obligations. The first few are found in the next chapter of Exodus. Exodus 20, let's begin in verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. There is a lot of law following this. Lots of religious practices, things like sacrifice and the tabernacle and the Sabbath day in much more detail. Feasts that are to be observed, and Sabbath years every 7th year that they were supposed to let the land rest, and Jubilee years every 50th year they were supposed to forgive all debts and let all slaves go. Civic practices that God regulates in the law, crime and punishment, particular procedures for how trials are to be conducted, sentencing and execution. Mercy is prescribed, as well as limits on prosecution and limits on penalties. There's a health code, dietary restrictions, dealing with certain illnesses and especially things like skin diseases, instructions for maintaining ritual purity. Now that fits under the religious code too, but there are health reasons for a lot of it. There are compulsory behaviors and there are prohibited behaviors. There are reactions to specific cases. For example, in Numbers chapter 27, "Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, from the clans of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest, and before the chiefs of all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died for his own sin. And he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them a possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers, and transfer the inheritance of their father to them." There are instructions for how the Israelites are to handle the upcoming conquest of the Promised Land. They're told how to live within a community of nations. Mostly that includes not acting like them with their idolatry and lots of other despicable practices like cult prostitution, human sacrifice. There's also a lot of narrative interspersed in the law, and sometimes there's a connection that's obvious, and sometimes there's not really. You could treat this all as a history by removing the longer chunks of law and just sticking to the narrative portions. So what's the story that these books tell? Well, it starts with creation, of course, and then sin enters the world, and then there's punishment for sin that culminates in a flood to wipe out mankind because they've become so sinful. After the remainder begins to rebuild, they are scattered, and Abraham and the patriarchs begin their story. We end up with their bondage and slavery in Egypt and their rescue by the hand of Moses, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Eventually, God leads them up east of the Jordan, and then they prepare to cross the Jordan and reclaim their birthright, the land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and promised would remain theirs throughout the generations. There are lots of other stories within this greater framework with lessons to teach. Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, Moses and the burning bush, the 10 plagues, the Passover, the Exodus, the Red Sea, bread from heaven, water from the rock, the giving of the law, the golden calf, building the tabernacle, Nadab and Abihu, the census, the 12 spies sent into the promised land, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram lead a rebellion, Balaam blesses Israel and then seduces them into idol worship, Moses recounting their journey and God's leadership and the law throughout Deuteronomy, and then finally Moses passing the torch to Joshua, and then Moses' death. But as much as I would like to dive into each and every one of these stories right here and now, there's just nowhere near enough time to cover them, and it would distract from the big picture in any case. In Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses introduce us to Abraham. "Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." We can see the land promise fulfilled when Abraham is given possession of a good portion of the land, as well as the offspring promise being fulfilled because Abraham and Sarah have a son. This occurs over the next several chapters with increasing frustration because, well, Sarah is barren. Well, eventually that gets taken care of, but then in the next generation, because remember, this isn't just for Abraham, it's for his offspring and on down the line. He's supposed to have a great nation of descendants. And their son, Isaac, marries a woman named Rebekah, and then Rebekah is barren. Well, eventually they still have a couple of children, Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob and his 4 wives have kind of the opposite problem. Far from being barren, he ends up with 12 sons and at least 1 daughter. By this point, Abraham's descendants have the land, including portions that Abraham bought, portions where they just staked a claim and lived in it as their own for several generations. And then it seems to fall apart when they have to go down to Egypt in order to escape a famine. Exodus tells the story of this nation becoming an actual nation and not just an ethnic group, which is what they were before. And then the rest of these books move them toward regaining their ancestral homeland as God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's one promise left. The end of verse 3. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now we can kind of see a fulfillment of this because, Abraham becomes a good neighbor, and so does Isaac, and the people around Jacob are blessed enormously, and it's the same with Joseph. It's harder to see this promise as being truly fulfilled when the Israelite nation is fighting and in some cases exterminating other families. Acts chapter 3 shows this prophecy being applied to the church. Verses 25 and 26. You are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first, to bless you, by turning every one of you from your wickedness. It's about Jesus. That's really the ultimate goal of this promise. And reading that promise in this way primes us to read not only the third one, but the first two, as if they weren't limited to those temporal short-term fulfillments. God promised Abraham and his offspring a homeland. And yes, he meant Israel, but he also means an eternal home in his presence. God promised Abraham a great nation of descendants. And yes, he meant Israel, but he also means the faithful. God said that all nations would be blessed through Abraham. Yes, he meant that Israel would be a blessing, but he also means Christ. Of those options, which would you say are the more important? Which ones matter most to you? Ultimately, that's the best thing about the Torah. You may find it interesting from a historical perspective. I certainly do. You may find it valuable for its moral lessons. I certainly do. You may appreciate the literary value of its storytelling. I do. You may appreciate the extended legal philosophy. I do. But even if you don't care for any of those aspects of these first 5 books of the Bible, there is something about them that matters to you. Not only do they predict the coming of Jesus, but they explain why we need salvation from sin, how God planned from the beginning to send Jesus as the unblemished Passover lamb. And they provide huge numbers of shadows, types, and allegories to help prepare us to better understand the Christ, as well as our own daily walk with God as we look forward to eternity with him. If the rest of the Old Testament vanished tomorrow, it would be a tragic loss, and we'd be much worse off. But Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy would still provide everything we really need to know about God's long-standing relationship with his people to prepare us for Christ, and even to teach us a bit about him. Pay attention to these books, and pay attention to where they're all pointing, because that's the only target worth our lifelong pursuit. If you'd like to learn more about the Torah, and more importantly about the Messiah it predicts, then we'd be happy to help you. You can get in touch with us at River Ridge by phone at 812-550-6234, or by email at info@riverridgechurch.org, or on our Facebook page, and we'd love to talk with you. Please join me again for Iron Sharpens Iron.